My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul University. It's a research center on the Catholic Church in the Global South. And I know a lot of you, but not all of you, so please introduce yourselves and please come to our events. We're always having fun things going on here at DePaul. So I'm going to introduce our one of our student leaders, Jessica Soriano Villada, who is a student leader in Tepeyac. She is majoring in network engineering and security and minoring in Catholic studies, which is awesome. And she is soon to be an MDiv student at the Catholic Theological Union. So give it up for Jessica.
Thank you, Dr. Cavanaugh. Once again, my name is Jessica Soriano Villada, and I'm a senior here at DePaul. It is a pleasure to have you guys here with us tonight. And I will be introducing the speaker for tonight. Sergio González is the assistant professor of history at Marquette University. A historian of 20th century U.S. migration, labor, and religion, his scholarship focuses on the development of Latino communities in the U.S. Midwest. He is the author of Mexicans in Wisconsin and the co-editor of Faith and Power, Latino Religious Politics since 1945. His most recent book, Strangers No Longer, Latino Belonging and Faith in 20th-Century Wisconsin, explores the relationship between Latino communities, religion, and social movements in the 20th century Midwest. Along with his academic scholarship, González is engaged in several public humanities projects, including serving as a public historian developing Wisconsin's new public history museum with the Wisconsin Historical Society, co-writing and co-hosting The Look Back, a social studies show for middle school students on Wisconsin PBS, and co-writing and co-hosting Sanctuary, on the border between church and state, a limited podcast series with Access Mundi Media. And if we will, give a warm welcome to our speaker, Sergio González.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches. What time is it? It's like in between, you know. How y'all doing today? You good? All right. I want to start by saying thank you to the center, to Bill, to Karen, to Marlon for all of their hospitality and bringing me down for this talk with you all tonight. And thank you to everybody who's streaming. Thank you for everybody who's here. And please don't be shy. Please keep getting food as we're doing our talk for today. I'm going to pull up my slides to make sure I have them here before I start going. All right. I have about 35, 40 minutes with you all here tonight. And I want to leave time for questions at the end. So I'm going to try to do this relatively quick. I've had the pleasure of going around the state of Wisconsin, the Midwest, a few parts of the United States to talk a little bit about my book that was just published last year. And every chance that I get an opportunity to talk with different audiences in different communities, I always start with a simple question. So I'm hoping you guys will come along with me here on this question, all right? So you're still eating. If you're trying to put food in your mouth, don't do this. But otherwise, if you're done, close your eyes. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. And I want you to imagine a Midwestern. Okay? Those of you in the back, good job just stopping and closing your eyes. That was good. All right. Now just turn to the people at your table and just quickly talk with them. Turn to your buddy next to you. When you imagine a Midwesterner, what comes to mind? What's the kind of the image of the person that comes to mind? Go for it.
I want to come around and just I want to get a few ideas. I want to get a few ideas from people. So either I can pop in and stick a microphone in your face, or you can raise your hand. One or the other. All right. I heard the first volunteer. Too bad. I heard you.
We said wheat, like cornfield, potatoes. Yeah.
All right. So it's a person standing in like a field of wheat or corn or potatoes or something. Okay. All right. Those are all different vegetables. Thank you. All right. What else comes to? How about what does the person look like? Let's start building this idea. So we have somebody who's in a field, what do they look like? All right, they're pointing.
Kind of came to mind is like, when I think of Midwest, for some reason I kind of thought of Wisconsin. So like, I'd say like a person, a white person that's like with like a red flannel on, maybe like some blue jeans. I was thinking that they probably had like some beer with them. Not gonna lie, so maybe something like that. Yeah, along those lines.
Okay, good. All right, so probably a farmer then, I'm guessing, if they're in a field of corn or wheat or corn. All right, they're wearing flannel. Maybe they got a little bit of beer gut. Yeah, and they're rocking a beer in their hand. All right. Anybody want to add to that? That's a pretty good composite. Yeah.
So my sister went to school in Iowa. We grew up in Chicago. She used to have a shirt that just said "Wholesome Midwestern Girl," and so when I picture a Midwesterner, I picture my sister, who basically looks like me. So.
Wholesome Midwesterner. All right. Wholesome Midwestern girl, wholesome Midwesterner, farmer. All right. So I've asked this. I'm just going to keep the mic on the whole time. All right. So I've asked this question a number of different times. I said, actually, since I came out with my first book in 2017, I've probably asked this question now. It's almost a decade, so probably thousands of people ask this question. And what you guys have described is, this is it, right? It's like the composite character. A farmer standing out in the field, a little bit of beer gut, nice person. What's the term, Bill, we were talking about? Midwestern nice, okay. And usually white. That's usually the idea that comes to mind when we think about the Midwest. I was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My family's originally from Jalisco, Mexico, both of my parents. My dad's family came in the 1950s to Wisconsin. My mom's family came to Wisconsin in the 1970s. And so when I was growing up, and to this day, when I think of the Midwest, yeah, I think of that. But I also think of my family. I think about hanging out on the south side of Milwaukee. I think about having some arracheras. I don't necessarily think about those rural spaces. I don't necessarily think about white people. I don't necessarily think about flannel, although I have plenty of flannel at home. So one of the things we're going to try to do today is to disrupt a little bit this narrative that we have about the Midwest. All right, and to do this, I want to think a little bit about one of my favorite scholars. Her name is Suke Vega. And if you think Latinos in Wisconsin is weird, she wrote a book about Latinos in Indiana. All right, and that one is called Latino Heartland. And she says in her book that this idea of the imagined Midwest that we have is far from reality. Now, she's an anthropologist, and so her book is an ethnographic study. That means she went around and she put a microphone in front of people and she interviewed them and she surveyed their community. And when she wrote her book, she was writing about present-day Indiana. So she was talking about the imagined Midwest we have today is not real. I'm a historian, and I'm here to tell you that the imagined Midwest we have in mind hasn't been real for a long time. That in fact, this region that often evokes this idea of a very particular type of person in a particular type of space has always been much more diverse than this idea of the white farmer out in the fields, even though that's the idea that comes to mind. And we all live in the Midwest. Imagine if I asked this question to somebody in LA or New York City or Miami, right? Even more stereotypical, kind of that farmer out in the fields, right? So I went to graduate school in 2012. I left a very well-paid job as a middle school teacher. But I went to school with a very singular objective, just a very like one big thing that I wanted to understand, right? I wanted to be a historian because I wanted to understand this simple question. Why in the world did my parents' family settle in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, of all places? Why not Los Angeles? Why not Arizona? Why not Texas? Heck, why not even Chicago, where there are much larger Mexican populations? So my goal was to go to school to understand that question, maybe write a book about the history of Latinos in the state of Wisconsin. My first trip to the archives, the summer of 2013, I was a second-year master's student. I had to write my master's thesis. And I went to the Milwaukee County Historical Society, which is the historical society for the city that I grew up in. And I had set aside my entire summer to do archival research. And for those of you who don't know what archival research is, it's digging in boxes and materials, oral histories, photographs, any little piece, any little vestige of the past that can help you understand the past, right? So I set aside the entire summer to dig and stuff. I went to the Milwaukee County Historical Society, and I said to the archivist, I want to see everything you have preserved on the history of Latinos in Wisconsin. Everything. All right, I'm ready to go. All right, doe-eyed, bushy-tailed, I'm pumped. The archivist goes in the back room, and this archive society is an old bank, so they literally keep the stuff in a vault. All right? So it goes in the vault, comes back with 3 boxes and puts them on the table and goes, there you go. 3 boxes about this big. That's not even enough to write like an undergraduate, like a freshman level paper, much less a master's thesis, much less a dissertation. All right? So I was pretty shook up. I was like, how the heck am I supposed to write this? How am I supposed to get a degree? How am I supposed to do this? I got over that initial shock. I opened up the first box. I want to show you the very first document I pulled out of a box. This is the first document I looked at as a master's student working on my dissertation. Ready? Okay, thank you. That's the audience participation. There's more of that, okay? Stay awake. All right, here we go. Okay, take a look at this image. So we're all going to act like history students for a few minutes. So, did you hear some groans? There was some groans somewhere, all right? No groaning. All right. So there's a primary source. You got to turn to the person sitting next to you again, your best friend, and you're going to just tell them, what do you see? Just break this down. What do you think it is? What's this image telling you? What are clues? Whatever. Go for it. All right. I'm going to have you yell it out, and I'll repeat it into the microphone for our friends at home. All right. What do you see? What do you see in this? A baptism? All right. Why do you think it's baptism? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're knocking it out of the park. All right, good. So looks to be some church steps. You have these families. They're all smiling. You got a baby, so maybe it's some sort of sacramental celebration, maybe a baptism, all right? Any other observations or guesses on what we're looking at here? Nice, nice. Okay, the hair. Look at that feathering, that mini afro. Very good. So it is indeed 1987, and it's the summer of 1987, okay? Any other observations? Thank you. Very good. All right. So the Milwaukee Journal is the newspaper of record for Milwaukee. This is their Sunday insert. So you're right. This is an entire special on the Latino community in Milwaukee. All right. Any other observations? All right. You ready for the twist? That's me. And I'm done. That's it. There's more. All right. How about that? So I'm pretty sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. This is the right career path for me, right? Yeah. Hey, hold on, there's more to this talk, all right? Hold on. Okay, so that's me. I was born in April, so yeah, my birthday's coming up. So I'm probably a few weeks old in this picture. I was born in April of 1987. And that's my mom, it's my dad, Tia's behind us, my aunt's behind us, and we are indeed walking out of a church that's Holy Trinity Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is the heart of, or was the heart of Latino Catholicism in the 1980s, right? It's, in fact, the oldest Latino church in the city of Milwaukee. So just imagine how I felt. That very first document that I pull out of a box is a picture of me with my family. When I went to graduate school, I knew I wanted to study Latinos in Wisconsin, but I didn't know how I wanted to study them. And this picture set me up. What I understood, or what I wanted to understand, and why it was that the newspaper of record for my city had decided that this image was the beating heart of this growing community. Why this image, right? Young families happy in front of a church, celebrating their faith. Now, for my family, practicing Catholics, faith had always been important for us. And we've been a pretty, I don't want to say religious family, but we were well observant. My mom especially went to church a lot, and not because she was extremely religious, although she is, because growing up for us, the church meant something special. It was, of course, a place that we went on Sundays to pray, to engage in fellowship with our family and with our community. But for my mom, the church was something extra. When I was growing up, my mom was a labor and immigrant justice activist. And for her, the church was not just a place to go and engage in fellowship, it was a place to organize. And so when I looked at this picture, I remembered, there's my wonderful mom over there, I remembered that she had participated in something called Labor in the Pulpit. This is a program developed by the AFL-CIO, the labor unions, where they work with local parishes, with local churches, local synagogues, And they send labor organizers into these spaces. And so you have this captive audience, right? You've gone to church and mass is over, service is over, and who comes to the front but someone who's there to tell you about the dignity of labor and about the Catholic Church's teaching on organizing and solidarity. So when I was growing up, the church had always been something extra. It wasn't just a place of fellowship, it was a place to organize. And so this picture helped set me on what I have been working on over the last few years, which is to try to understand Latino communities in a lot of different ways. So my first book that I wrote, I was in graduate school, called Mexicans in Wisconsin. It's this brief overview of the history of Mexican settlement in our state, which is over 100 years long. And the book that I just published that came out last year, Strangers No Longer, Latino Belonging and Faith in 20th-Century Wisconsin, delves more deeply into the stories of Latino faith and Latino social movement building within churches. I love this cover because it was made by a good friend, John Fleister, who's an art educator. He does a lot of the artwork for Voz de la Frontera, which is our immigrant justice organization in Milwaukee. This is a linoleum cut. And there's that church. And then look in the corner. Yeah, he did that, but I didn't ask him to. That was nice. He did a good job. So I want to tell you a little bit about this book, and I'm going to tell you that the framework, the thread that binds these stories for me to better understand the question of not just community formation, but social movement within churches is something that migration scholars have been turning to over the last, let's say, about 30 years to try to understand this global migration that's been occurring all across the world. And that is the question specifically of hospitality. Now, when we think about hospitality, hospitality can bring to mind a lot of different ideas. You know, hospitality can often bring to mind this idea of being hospitable to someone. It even brings this idea of Midwestern nice, right? Who's offering them a warm smile, a helping hand. But hospitality study scholars have understood hospitality as being something bigger than that. It's a set of relationships that we have with people who are different from us. And it's the way in which we relate to people who are different from us. And we can think about this as not just a way of being nice to somebody by thinking about something like the table fellowship, right? Inviting people to our table. So here's one example. I'm going to talk a little bit about this example in a second here. In the 1950s, 15,000 migrant farm workers traveled from Texas to Wisconsin every single year. 15,000 people every single year went to Wisconsin from Texas to pick the state's crops. And they often encountered a very difficult reception, which we'll talk about in a moment. But some of those Texas Mexican kids, or Tejano kids, were invited to a table. Here you see some Catholic nuns, some sisters, who have created a table fellowship between white residents of central Wisconsin and Texas Mexican migrant farm worker children. Now, that in its own is a form of hospitality, but there's really, just looking at the picture, nothing really special, although we'll unpack that in just a second. But let me show you another example of table fellowship that draws specifically from the Catholic faith, and that is, of course, the Eucharist. So what if the Eucharist was transformed into something political? Not just the breaking of the bread, not just the consecration of the host, but in fact, the entire practice of inviting people to engage in the Eucharist became an act of political solidarity, with migrant farm workers who in the 1960s fasted in support of the rights of unionization. So here in 1969 at St. Patrick's Church in south side of Milwaukee, these migrant farm workers had been on a fast to support union organizing in California and in Wisconsin. And Father John Maurice, a white Catholic priest, used the resources of the church to support their unionizing and invited them to finish and break their fast through the Eucharist right here. So it's a different form of hospitality. It's still the same idea, inviting people in, being welcoming, but here it has a specific political connotation. So here's what I want us to understand when we think about hospitality, that hospitality is more than just being welcoming. It's more than just being Midwestern nice, which to me, as somebody who grew up in this region, Midwestern nice just means passive aggressive, okay? It's a lot more than just that. And the reason I care about these questions, as we'll see today, is that for about 100 years, Latinos in Wisconsin have often been considered strangers. They're guests. And there's a lot of different ways we think about that. The way in which they've been invited to the state as guest workers. The ways in which they've been invited to the state as temporary sojourners, visitors for a short amount of time. But Latinos now have been in Wisconsin for over 100 years. And in fact, there are generations of people of Latino descent who call Wisconsin home. Yet on the whole, Wisconsin media still refers to Wisconsin Latinos as newcomers. So here's what I want to understand. There's that same church, Our Lady of Guadalupe, where I was baptized. The book is trying to ask this question. How did, so this is a question of the past, Wisconsin churches practice hospitality with and towards Latinos throughout the 20th century, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that today. But the reason I care about this question, as we'll get to by the end of our conversation today, is because I don't think this is a question about the past. I think it's very much a question about our present and our future. So the book title kind of gives it away, but I am invested in this question of how churches move beyond thinking of Latinos as strangers, right? Thinking of this idea of welcoming the stranger and moving towards the book of Ephesians call for us to think of Latinos as strangers no longer, right? As constitutive members of our communities, as neighbors, as people that our state can't live without, can't function without. So I'm going to give us two case studies to think about this, all right? We're going to do two chapters from the book. We're going to do chapter 2 and chapter 6 to think about this. Two different examples. One example of not so good hospitality. One example of a more fulsome, a more practical form of hospitality. All right, so to get us started, all of you, of course, know your Wisconsin geography, right? Okay, well, we're going to find out. All right, so first of all, that's where Wisconsin is, all right? Just to make sure you remember that. Okay, all right. So in the 1950s, Wisconsin became the #1 canning state in the entire nation. That means that Wisconsin produced more canned fruits and vegetables than any other state in the nation. Believe it or not. Now, to get that work done, there were not enough Wisconsinites who were out in the fields. So Wisconsin farmers began to recruit migrant farm workers from southern Texas, specifically places like the Rio Grande Valley, Carrizo Springs, Crystal City. And every single year, 15,000 Texas Mexicans or Mexican Americans who lived in Texas would get into their cars and would travel northward. So you can see the way in which they disperse all across the country. They came all across the Midwest, including Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio. So I want us to think about one of these families. Here you go. There's a family, the Almanderes family. The Almanderes family was from Carrizo Springs, right in that borderlands region. And every single year they would get in their car, all right, and they would point their car wherever they wanted to go. Now, the thing to know, if you don't know, migrant farm work is family work, and it is for two different reasons. One, because if these families are leaving their home in Texas in spring to head northward, they're not going to be there to be a babysitter, right? So everybody's got to come along. But number two, more importantly, these are families that were working poor, and they needed everybody in the fields to do picking. Because if you could stand, you can contribute to the family's economy. So I want us to imagine a family like the Almanderes family that every year travels from Carrizo Springs up to Wisconsin. They would work all different types of crops. They would usually finish in the summertime in Door County, where they pick cherries. I want us to think about a family like this one. Not exactly this one, but a family like this one, right? In the summer of 1949, a family like the Almanderes family was picking in central Wisconsin in a place called Waupun, right there, right in the middle of an area that's known as the Pickle Belt, all right, because they produce more pickled cucumbers than any other part of the nation. You have a family like the Almanderes family that every day, sun up, sun down, is in the field picking cucumbers. You guys know what cucumber work is like? It's tough work because cucumbers grow near the ground, right? So you're literally bent over all day doing this work. It's called stoop labor, all right? It's literally back-breaking work. So they're working poor families. They don't have a lot of money to get recreation for the kids. But after a long day in the fields, they want to give the kids an opportunity to cool off. What better place than the public pool? So in 1949, a family like the Almanderes family, after having spent the week picking in the fields, took their kids and a bunch of other families to the local park in Waupun, Wisconsin. And this is what they encountered. Showed up at the pool, and the park custodian, Seymour Patrick, denied the kids entry into the pool. Wouldn't let them get in. Wouldn't let them get in the water. Now, he was interviewed that night by the local press, and they asked him, "Why did you bar these kids' entry?" And he said, "Well, Waupun parents said they didn't want their kids in the pool with those Mexicans because A, they don't speak Spanish. I've never been able to figure why you need to speak English to swim. Pardon me, they don't speak English. I don't know why you need to speak English to swim, but that's the first one. They don't speak English. And number two, those kids are dirty and carry tuberculosis. What do you think happened to that park custodian the next day, Seymour Patrick? What do you think happened to him? Got a raise? Any other guesses? Nothing? Promoted mayor the next year, maybe? He got fired the next day. Twist. It's because as all of you know, rural Wisconsin is the most progressive part of the Midwest, right? That's not it. That's not it. Why did Seymour Patrick lose his job the very next day? Anybody want to guess? No, I talked to the media. That's a good guess, but no, that's not it. Ooh, we're getting closer now. Now listen. Those migrant farm workers in the 1950s were considered the last vestiges of enslavement and peonage labor in this country, right? There were 500 reports published by the federal government and state commissions across the country in the 1950s just on migrant farm workers. They called them the stepchildren of America. America's destitute. I mean, these were like, they had no rights, right? They had no power, but they had one specific ability. And that was every single year when they got in their car in Texas, they decided where they were going to travel to. Because as American citizens, they have a right to decide where they're going to go and live and work. So in Wisconsin, especially in the pickle belt, those farmers freaked out. They were afraid that word was going to get back down to Texas, to those Texas Mexicans, that this is how Wisconsin treated those migrant farm workers. And so the state of Wisconsin went into a bit of triage, right? They went into crisis mode. This is one of the editorials, of which there were many published in the 1950s, imploring Wisconsinites to treat migrant farm workers better. So this is from the Milwaukee Sentinel, another newspaper in Milwaukee, and this one is an editorial from the editorial board. It's called "Let's Give Migrants a Better Break." So I want to focus on these two sentences here. Migrant crews which swarm into Wisconsin by the thousands are an economic asset to the state and make the difference between success and failure in many of our harvesting operations. They give us valuable service and deserve decent treatment while they're giving it. Oh, that sounds nice, right? That sounds better. We should treat them better. But what? I see some of you cringing. What's the cringe for? Hold on, I'm gonna put the microphone right in your face. Yeah.
It's transactional and only contingent on the work that they contribute.
You used my favorite word, contingent. There it is. All right, all of you English scholars in the room, you know this is a reflexive sentence. They give it to us, so it's an if-then. If they give us a valuable service, then we should give them decent treatment. Now, we should think of the opposite of that. What happens when those people no longer give us valuable treatment? How should we treat them? Okay? So this is exactly right, a form of contingent hospitality. It was a form of welcome that was dependent on what those people gave the state of Wisconsin. In other words, it's not a full form of hospitality. We should treat them better because they give us their labor. And if they don't, well, ... Now, to try to address this bad break that migrants had gotten, the first group that tried to do something were religious organizations. And the first religious organization that tried to put a better face in the state of Wisconsin was the Wisconsin Council of Churches. In the 1950s, the Wisconsin Council of Churches developed something called the Migrant Ministry Program. And this was part of a national program developed by a council of churches, state council of churches all across the country that tried to do religious outreach towards these migrant families. So this is one of their promotional brochures. You can see the incitement of scripture right there to try to induce better treatment from Wisconsin Christians, Wisconsin Protestants. You always see the kids are always featured, right? Because it's supposed to kind of draw on your heartstrings a little bit, those poor kids. One of the things that the Wisconsin Council of Churches did is they sent out roving migrant ministers into the field. This is what they look like. Okay, so they had these station wagons that were prepared by the National Council of Churches on the East Coast. They were driven out all over the country. They were staffed almost exclusively by women, all right, and almost exclusively by white women, young white women who were often doing missionary work. And they would roll into the camps. So this is a picture from central Wisconsin. See again, evoking those poor kids in the front. I want you to look at the car though. So the station wagon, this migrant mobile unit, was called the Harvester. Now, the harvester had two connotations, a little bit of a double entendre, right? So one, they're going to go and provide religious services for those harvesters, for the migrant families, right? But the people inside the cars, those migrant ministers, were also harvesters. They were going out to harvest some souls, because one of their objectives was to proselytize and get some conversions while they were out there. Now, most Texas Mexicans who came to Wisconsin or across the United States were Catholic. Many of them were unchurched. In other words, they were baptized, but they never went to church because they're on the road. So this was a audience that could be brought over to the Protestant faith. Another form of contingent hospitality, right? We offer you a religious service with the expectation that perhaps you will join us in our faith. Now, lest you think this was just the Protestants. The reason the Protestants were out there is because the Catholics paid no attention to these migrants until they heard about those migrant ministers, at which point the Green Bay Diocese and the Milwaukee Archdiocese and the Madison Diocese began to develop their own migrant ministry programs a few years later. And their focus was exactly the same, except they were trying to keep these migrants within the faith. And the way we know this is that they invested most of their money in religious instruction on the kids. And the most money was often spent on the celebration at the end of the summer, which is a large baptism and first communion for all the kids to make sure that they stayed within the church. And most of the money went not into providing social services for the families, not into providing health services, but to make sure that they had their white vestures for the sacraments. So you see here Bishop Stanislaus Bona, the bishop of the Green Bay Diocese, at one of these celebrations in the summer of 1956. The faces of these indifferent children. Another form of contingent hospitality. But guess what? In the 1950s, these programs developed in central Wisconsin, well, they did it. They solved racism. That's what it says here. The Milwaukee Journal announces that these programs, these forms of contingent hospitality, have fixed the problem. A year ago, Waupun had a race problem, but it's been solved. Again, those smiling, cute children's faces, right, to evoke a sense of pity. The reality, of course, is that these Band-Aid solutions did nothing to alleviate the material circumstances under which migrant farm workers lived and worked when they were in the state of Wisconsin. And it wouldn't be until migrant farm workers organized themselves into labor unions in the 1960s, went on strike, took to marches, that actual changes happened in the economy, in the economic systems under which they work. But you'll have to read the book to find out more about that. All right. So that's the first form of hospitality, a form of contingent hospitality that's failed. I want to switch. We're going to go forward to the 1980s. I want to talk about a different form of hospitality. And that specifically is one that my good friend Gina Perez, who was here a few weeks ago, talked about. And that is the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. What you see here in this image is the opening of sanctuary at St. John's Cathedral in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in December of 1982. As Milwaukee churches and synagogues came together to declare their houses of worship safe spaces, places of safe harbor for Guatemalans and Salvadorans who were fleeing revolutionary wars in their home country. You see, in the 1980s, this region right here, this region of Central America, was racked in a series of revolutions and bloody civil wars. Some of them had been going on for decades. The result of these bloody conflicts was the death of 250,000 people and the expulsion of 2 million more. I want you to wrap your head around that. 2 million people leaving this small area looking for safe harbor. 2 million people crossing over into Mexico. 1 million of those people made their way to the United States. And when they arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border, these people from Guatemala and El Salvador tried to avail themselves of the 1980 Refugee Act, which allowed them to claim political asylum if they could show that they were fleeing persecution, if they had a well-founded fear of persecution. And many of these people would show up at the U.S.-Mexico border with bullet holes in their hands, telling stories of their family being murdered by death squads. Despite having clear proof that they were fleeing these circumstances, 98% of Guatemalan and Salvadorans who applied for political asylum in the 1980s had their cases denied. 98%. which meant that on average, the United States was deporting 1,000 people back to this region during that decade. 1,000 people. Why? Well, even though the United States had a law that said that they had to assess these people's claims equally, the United States during the 1980s was also investing hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid into the region. In other words, if the U.S. recognized these people as political asylees, they would have to recognize their own role in destabilizing those countries in the first place. So churches along the U.S.-Mexico border saw this happening. And at first they thought, well, maybe these people just aren't filling out their applications correctly. So the first thing they did is they invested lots of money in legal aid. That did nothing. And they grew frustrated with the federal government. And so in the spring of 1982, churches in Tucson and in San Francisco decided to take a drastic step. They declared their churches sanctuaries for these Central Americans. So you see here the opening of sanctuary at Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson. This became kind of a public spectacle that was repeated all across the country throughout the 1980s, a press conference where churches were inviting an individual who was often masked to protect his identity back home or their identity back home. And they're announcing to the United States they're going to take this drastic step. Now, the way they did this was to do it publicly. And they did it for two reasons. One, because they figured if they did it in private, there was a better chance that they'd get in trouble. But if they did it publicly, they could kind of bring that public spotlight on their work. So they sent a letter to the Immigration Naturalization Service, to the FBI, to the Department of Justice, the president, and said, hey, we're doing this. What they were basically doing was playing a game of chicken with the federal government because they dared the federal government to come into their churches and rip these people out of houses of worship. And they figured that the Reagan administration, which had ridden into the White House as being the most Christian presidency in the 20th century, would not want the nightly news showing images of FBI agents dragging a refugee out of a church and dragging a priest with his collar out of a church as well. That wouldn't look good for a Christian president. But they also did this to magnify their movement and to get Americans involved in the work. They argued that the work that they were doing was in fact an act of what they called radical hospitality, that their faith traditions taught them, implored them, demanded that they open up their houses of worship to these people. Now, the Old Testament has only one commandment to love your God, but more than 36 injunctions to welcome the stranger, right? It couldn't be any clearer in either of the books. And so when these people engaged in this work of radical hospitality, they were not being radical in the idea of being political radicals. They were being radical and they were grabbing at the root of what it meant to be hospitable. You didn't ask why somebody needed help. You just did it. So this movement, which began in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, very quickly spread. It made its all the way up to, well, guess what? Chicago, which in the summer of 1982 opened up the first Midwestern churches as places of sanctuary for undocumented Salvadorans and Guatemalans who were seeking asylum. Here it is at Wellington Avenue United Church of Christ here in Chicago, the first sanctuary church in the city. Chicago became the hub of the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. It was home to the Chicago Religious Task Force on Central America, which became the coordinating body for the movement. They published a monthly newspaper called Basta. They developed these discernment packets that went to churches and synagogues all across the country to help congregations go through that process of deciding whether or not they wanted to become sanctuaries. And most importantly, they helped move people from the border all across the country, including to Wisconsin. So you see here, sanctuary very quickly took off. What started off in the borderlands region, where people were arriving, with the help of the Chicago Religious Task Force, exploded to sanctuary congregations all across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people of faith engaged in this work in the 1980s, including in Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin was special because it was the city with the first Jewish synagogue, the first Latino congregation, and the first black churches in the country to become sanctuaries. All of those happened in 1982 and 1983. Here you see Cristo Rey Catholic Church, which in 1982 declared itself a sanctuary. Father Glenn Geisner, who had been a missionary in Nicaragua, had been exposed to liberation theology, had seen some of this death and destruction. He came back and helped his congregation discern whether or not they'd become a sanctuary. Many of the congregants at Cristo Rey were themselves immigrants. Some of them were still undocumented. So they were taking a big risk by becoming a sanctuary because they were putting themselves in danger. But they argued they had an obligation to do this work, to open up their churches to someone like Jorge, who was fleeing revolution in El Salvador. Or in the spring of 1983, Cross Lutheran Church on the north side of Milwaukee, which became the first black church in the country to become a sanctuary for Central Americans. Now, for those black congregants who joined this movement, for them, the reference point were things like the Underground Railroad of the 19th century, when abolitionists had engaged in a form of a challenge to state power, right? They opened up their churches for people who were fleeing enslavement, seeking freedom in the United States. And so black congregants at Cross Lutheran said they had an obligation to do this work, not only because of their faith teachings, but because of their own history. So I want to share the words of one of the congregants, Pat Coleman, who was on the church committee that decided to make the church a sanctuary. This is what Pat Coleman said when they opened up their church. I know all about oppression. In my case, if I were in trouble, and if I got to someone's house that was my same ethnic background, black people, then I knew I had some kind of shelter. I was deathly afraid until I left Mississippi in 1950 and came to Chicago and then Milwaukee. I remember my folks being afraid. So it wasn't an effort at all for me to be supportive of Cross becoming a sanctuary. After listening to Jorge, it was like I felt the Spirit of the Lord there with us as we pledged to serve and help those people and try to make our government aware of how we felt. And I guess that I felt that night that it had to be said to everybody that Christianity reaches out all over the world. And at that time, it was just a feeling I never felt. We sang We Shall Overcome. I was holding Jorge's hand. I just can't tell you how I felt, the sensitivity I felt for him, all the hurt he had been through as I held his hand, and we sing that song. And I just know that it will happen. There will be a better day. And there could not be a clear enunciation of a fulsome, robust understanding of hospitality. Someone whose own experience had felt ostracization, had felt that they had been pushed to the margins, had felt unsafe, and someone had offered them help, and she felt it was her obligation to do the same to the next person behind her. This movement lasted an entire decade. This is when I teach about the sanctuary in my class. I have to remind my students that this movement began in 1982 and did not end until 1990. Ended up being one of the most successful social movements in the history of the United States because by 1990, the sanctuary movement had successfully sued the federal government and forced them to re-adjudicate hundreds of thousands of asylum cases. In other words, they had to allow hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans and Guatemalans to be able to reapply for political asylum in this country. And they lobbied Congress to pass in the Immigration Act of 1990 a whole new status called Temporary Protected Status, or TPS. Created this whole new status for people who are fleeing civil wars or natural disasters in their home country. Hundreds of thousands of people benefited from this radical form of hospitality. All right, so I got a few minutes left. I want to finish with a few points of what this means for us today. This is what our Latino population in Wisconsin looks like today, all right? I told you we're going to take it to the present. This is the 2020 census, and what you see is the darker it is, the larger percentage change in its Latino population. Here's Milwaukee, Racine and Kenosha, here's Dane County. What you see is that every single county in Wisconsin, except for one, that's Menominee Reservation land, every single county in Wisconsin has seen a growth in its Latino population. Latinos now account for about 500,000 residents. They are the largest minority population in the state of Wisconsin. Now that we've had a very quick tour of the history of Latinos in the state, the question we should ask ourselves is what type of reception are they receiving in these places? How are they being invited or welcomed into these parts of the state? And again, not just in Milwaukee, but in a place like Trempealeau County, Arcadia, which is a very, very small town. Arcadia, which in the early 2000s, Ashley Furniture, the furniture company, recruited Mexican immigrants to come to the area to work at their factory. If you go to Arcadia today, I was there this past summer, you drive down the main street in Arcadia, Wisconsin, this small town, and then when I say main street, I mean the street. You drive through the street, it's like driving through the south side of Milwaukee. There's Latino barbershops, Latino grocery stores, panaderias. I mean, it's completely transformed the space. You go to an elementary school in Arcadia today. The majority of students in Arcadia elementary schools are Latino immigrants. Absent their arrival in the town of Arcadia, Arcadia would be dead. So we should ask ourselves, what's it like to be Latino in Arcadia? We should ask ourselves, what's it like to be Latino in the state of Wisconsin? The state legislature every single year tries to pass a bill to make English the official language of the state. Mind you, this doesn't do anything but remind people who belongs and who doesn't. Or you go to a place like Whitewater, not too far from the Illinois border. It's a college town, which over the last year saw a growth in its Venezuelan and Guatemalan population. A place where Senator Ron Johnson brought national media to the town to say this is an example of what he said, Biden's border crisis arriving in Wisconsin. Mind you, these were people who were asylum seekers who had legal right to be in the nation, but were posited as illegal invaders in the state. Now, the question is, what does this mean for the Midwest? Well, there's Illinois, 50% growth, Michigan, 29% growth, Minnesota, 38% growth, Indiana, 42% growth, Iowa, 42% growth. Every single state in our region has seen a large growth in its Latino population, and it's happening in places that have often not had Latino communities. You just look at the purple scattered across you. Or I think about a place, the state that has seen the most rapid growth in its Latino population and perhaps the most rapid growth in its immigrant population. Ohio. And I think about the way in which immigrants in general in Ohio have been treated over the last year. I think about other Latin American immigrants or Caribbean immigrants to the region in a place like Springfield, Ohio. The way in which Haitian newcomers to the area. Anybody know under what immigration designation those Haitians in Springfield lived? TPS, temporary protected status, that same legal category created by sanctuary activists. So I think about the way in which they felt welcomed in this space in the last year. Or think about the way in which they have been invited to stay in that space over this last year. Now, I've been giving a talk like this similarly over the last year or so since the book came out. And every once in a while I have to update it because something else is happening in immigration youth. So this one is from a few weeks ago. You may have heard about this case. Wisconsin voter, whose wife is Peruvian. They were going through her legalization process after their marriage. They were coming back from Puerto Rico, and for those of you who don't know, Puerto Rico is not in international waters. So they weren't traveling with a passport or anything like that. They arrived at Mitchell Airport in Milwaukee, and as they got off the plane, ICE agents were waiting for his wife, and they took her into detention. Now, of course, you can open up any newspaper today and you see instances of this happening. People's citizenship being questioned, people's status being questioned, their right to belong being questioned, the boundaries of hospitality being constrained and constrained and constrained. I think the ironic thing about this, or at least the sad thing, is that they interviewed the man, the husband, and he said he would have voted for the president again. And he said he was thinking of moving to Peru. So cognitive dissonance when we think about some of these situations. So I think to myself, what can this history teach us? What can we imagine as different forms of hospitality in 2025? How can we look to examples from the past and how communities are taking examples from the past and changing them just a little bit to work their political moment? So after the last election of the current president, students in Milwaukee demanded that their school district become a sanctuary for their friends. That that ethic of hospitality, of radical hospitality that had been born in religious spaces, be taken into secular spaces. Those practices of welcome become ingrained in the way in which Wisconsinites understood their homes. Because ultimately, after 100 years, over 100 years of settlement in this state, all Latinos want to see is themselves as part of this larger community, to understand that regardless of their documentation status, regardless of their ancestry, by very merit of existing in this place, making family in this place, making community in this place, they're as much a part of the Midwest as anybody else. Thank you. Take a few questions? Can I take a few questions? Yeah? All right. I'm going to come back to you. Sorry, the camera can't. I'll speak really loud. Oh, you can make it move? Oh my gosh, look at that. All right.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and your thoughts for all of us to think about. You opened your talk with a primary source and your description of receiving 3 boxes. But as I watched your presentation, you provided attributions to other repositories. So you talked a little bit more about how those 3 boxes didn't give you what you needed and how you did additional primary source research.
Yes, archives question. All right, for all the historians in the room. I love it. All right. So it's 2 things. One is Latino historians, by the very merit of the work, know that their communities have not been archived. And so there are certain tools that we are trained in as scholars to do this work. One is to read against the grain, right? And sometimes you have to find sources that are not published specifically as Latino history, and you have to dig in them. And so it's twice as much work because I can't just type in Latino in the repository. It's going to give me 50 hits, right? I have to go and find them in different spaces. The second is you have to read sources and find the voices of people whose voices are not in there. So a lot of the sources that I use are government reports. And government reports are notoriously terrible at recording the voices of the people that they're actually studying. So these migrant ministers, the nice thing about churches, they leave great records. So once I started digging in the parishes and archdiocesan records, a lot of stuff. But it's all written by the priests. It's all written by the roving migrant ministers. The voices of the people themselves are absent, or when they're there, they're completely mediated by the people who wrote the reports. So it's all glowing reports of how wonderful it is to live in Wisconsin, which of course is just completely distinct from what I'm seeing and everything else. The third thing, and I think the most important thing, is recovering the archives ourselves. So any Latino historian worth his merit is a good oral historian. All right, so I've been conducting oral history since I was in graduate school. I helped found a group called the Wisconsin Latinx History Collective, and it's a bunch of academic and public historians in the state of Wisconsin. And we train undergraduate students to do this work for us because they're free and free labor is great, but also because they become the next generation of the scholars that we want to create to do this work. So they go into the community and they conduct these oral histories. We develop a relationship with the Wisconsin Historical Society, and they're going to serve as a repository for these. We've conducted hundreds of oral histories, and they're going to be live within the next few years once they get their act in order at the Historical Society to make sure that what I experienced when I was in graduate school doesn't happen to other graduate students. Thank you. Now,
apologize in advance, it's a little ill-formed, but one of the early photos that you showed and an example of non-contingent hospitality was of a priest at the altar with the migrants that were with them. So he was clearly showing great support and advocacy for this group. What I find today, bringing in the Catholic Church again, is that support of that kind is almost like a third rail. We do more of a decentralized help in a social justice way for various communities, including the migrants. But it is not part of the complete dialogue that's happening within the Catholic Church. And as far as homilies go, well, it's just non-existent. So I'm not sure where my question is here, but what to do, how to respond to that, how to see that it becomes part of our dialogue and the importance in our church.
It's a great question, and I think it's one that probably a lot of us in this room are thinking about as we look at those images of this Catholic priest celebrating the Eucharist with a bunch of radical union activists standing right behind him, right? I mean, this is just something it's hard for us to imagine happening in most of these cities. Not to mean it doesn't happen. I think a lot of criticism that comes from clergy, and I think specifically within the Catholic faith, is very mediated. It's toned down, and what it lacks is an explicit challenge to state power. So the thing that made that activism in the 60s or the activism in the 80s unique is that these were clergy and laity who understood that you could not separate faith from politics because we live out our faith in civic spaces, right? That's just the reality of it. And you have these clergy that were taking a risk. And it was a risk because they were often sanctioned by their bishops, or by the 1980s in the sanctuary movement, there were conservative Catholics that were trained in how to observe them in the pews and write to the Vatican to try to get them excommunicated. I mean, they're tried and true tactics. And so today, it's hard to find clergy or laity who are willing to push them to do this type of action, and specifically action that's going to put them in contradiction with the state. And for me, the thing that I care most about is migrant justice, so I see how this plays out in migrant spaces. And even to the point now where the current administration has suspended the federal funding that goes into migrant services for the Catholic Church, still the Catholic bishops refuse to do more than put out statements. I don't have an answer, but what I do know is what the church is doing today is not working. And it's not meeting the challenge at the moment. And at a moment where the federal administration has declared religious spaces no longer sacred spaces, right? I mean, they rescinded, the Trump administration, one of the first things they did when they stepped into power in January was rescind something called the sensitive location memos, which bars Immigration and Customs Enforcement from entering hospitals, schools, and churches. In other words, as the borders are for the Trump administration, Tom Homan said, the gloves are off. ICE agents can go into any of these spaces to engage in immigration enforcement. Where is the radical outcry from the clergy, from the bishops?
You said you started your graduate journey with the question of why did your parents go to Wisconsin? Did you ever answer that question?
Pretty boring. It's the same reason most of our families came here, for a better life. That's it. Why Wisconsin? There were jobs there. There were jobs there. So my dad's family came in the 50s, and they came for industrial work. My grandpa worked at Case Automotive in Racine, and my mom's family came in the 70s. A lot of those industrial jobs were gone at that point, so they came for agricultural work and tannery work. So Milwaukee was the #1 tannery city in the United States. That's pretty nasty work. You guys know what tannery work is, taking cow hides and making them into leather. Caustic, disgusting work, but that's the work that was available. So their story is not special, which I think is special, because all it means is just like millions of immigrants before them, they just came to this place looking for a better life for their kids. Other questions? Yes. Thanks. Nice.
So you talked about the sanctuary movement and the impacts that had, and the cross movement solidarity and different congregations coming up with that. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the present and how you see, because I feel like a lot of times with certain organizations or communities, we often talk about how great they were in the past and look at how things were, I'm not going to call out any specific organization, but we often in circles go visit places and are like, oh wow, look at how great we were in the past. And within the church today, or within society broader, where do you see those sparks of hope and where the Spirit is moving, and where are the movements for liberation and sparks happening in any parts of the present?
It's a great question, and I think you're right. There is a trap we can fall into, romanticize the past, and that's dangerous for two ways. One, it's bad history, but two, it makes us imagine that things happened back then and can't happen again today. But of course, the reason I like to focus on issues like sanctuary, my good friend Lloyd Barba, who's a professor at Amherst College in Massachusetts, he's writing a book on the sanctuary movement, and one of the things that he focuses on is this idea of usable sacred past, right? So what are the ways in which religious activists in the sanctuary movement look to their past and use them as fuel for the work they were doing in the present? If they did it in the 80s, why can't people do that again today? And not only as a pragmatic way of building a movement, but to join a longer lineage of resistance that is not radical in the political sense again. It is at the root of what people of faith can do within their religious spaces. So you can kind of see in some of the things that I pulled out, I am very interested in these intersectional movements, because those are going to be the most powerful ones. They're also the most fragile ones, because you're holding together contingents of people that come with different ideologies, with different needs, with different objectives in mind. But when you can get the choir to sing together, I mean, that is one of the most powerful examples that we have. So why was Sanctuary successful in the 80s? It's because they brought together Jews and Christians. They brought together Black, Latino, and white church people. You know, they brought together conservatives and liberals, right? The political ideology didn't matter. What mattered is people were upset that their taxpayer dollars were going to fund these military machines in Central America and forcing these people to be killed. So for me, what I think people of faith need to do is to, again, reach into that bag of usable sacred histories and to understand that this is part of their traditions. They are not stepping out of line. They are not doing something radical. It's just merely what they do as people of faith. And then to look to other people of faith, other people who are engaged in struggles to try to do that work. Do I find examples that are working today? I think that I'll just stay within the lane of migrant justice. I think churches that engage in sanctuary movements 5-6 years ago are still trying to figure out what to do today. And the biggest reason that they're scared is because they are afraid to call the Trump administration's bluff. They're afraid that if they invite someone into sanctuary, ICE agents will come and take that person out. And that's a very real fear. So it means it's time for some innovation. I certainly don't have the answer. I'm a historian, or else I'd be out there with them. When I was a graduate student, I organized for Sanctuary. I had maybe a little more gumption to do that work, but the political terrain has shifted. Under the first Trump administration, the word I hated the most was unprecedented. What we're seeing today is unprecedented. What we're seeing today is unprecedented. This is something different, all right? I do believe that the guardrails are off in many ways. And unfortunately, what that means is that people of faith are going to have to push the limits a little bit, and they're probably going to have to mess up. There could be mistakes made. But that's the only way they're going to be able to meet what's happening today. Putting out statements, it's not going to do it.
Does the concept of the sanctuary movement from religious leaders have anything to do with or lead into like sanctuary city movements? And if so, could you speak to that? It seems like it because you're nodding your head.
Phenomenal question, and I am nodding indeed. With my friend Lloyd Barba, we just published a piece in Time a few weeks ago about this connection, so it's a good question. Yeah, sanctuary cities are born out of the sanctuary movement. In the 1980s, people of faith decide, hey, we got to take this movement out of the pews and into the streets, and they go to their municipalities, go to city councils, they go to county councils, they even go to their states, right, to governors, and they demand that they stop using state and local resources to do the work of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or back then INS, Immigration Naturalization Services. So the first sanctuary cities are developed in the 1980s, right, in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Madison, Wisconsin, here in Chicago, right? Chicago declares itself a sanctuary city under Mayor Harold Washington in the 1980s, and Chicago has had some form of sanctuary policies for over 40 years. What happens, however, is that this movement is so successful that anytime there's a successful social movement, there is often a successful counter movement. And so what we see today is while sanctuary politics continue to bubble up in 2025, what is more prevalent are anti-sanctuary politics. The current president ran explicitly on an anti-sanctuary platform, right? His entire platform was, I'm going to defund sanctuary cities. By taking away sensitive locations, that memo from 2011 that allows ICE agents to go into churches, he is violating the concept of sanctuary, right? So what we have to understand is whenever something works, we shouldn't be surprised when there is a pushback against it. So that's why today, sanctuary activists, both in sacred spaces and secular spaces, are trying to figure out how to navigate this. A few weeks ago, the House Oversight Committee had this big show of force, right? They demanded that the mayors of Chicago, Boston, Denver, and New York City come to Washington, D.C. and answer for their sanctuary politics. And so the mayors of Chicago, Boston, Denver, and New York City went to Washington, D.C. to do that. And they all availed themselves very well. They spoke very passionately about the need for these sanctuary politics. They argue that these politics make their city safer because it allows local law enforcement to do the work of protecting and serving the community instead of doing the work of federal immigration enforcement, and allows people who have different statuses to feel comfortable going to the police if something has happened to them or someone they love, right? So it allows these spaces to feel safer. Study after study after study has shown that sanctuary cities are safer than those that don't have these policies. But the reality is that making reasoned arguments is never going to win the day. It's not about who has better facts. It's about power. And so unless these communities continue to build their power and develop more sanctuary spaces, they're going to be fighting this uphill battle.
So, America has this long history of people coming over here and they really want to belong. And one of the ways they belong over time is you become hyper-American, and that means keeping other people out, right? You know, our borders are our borders and so on. So there's a sense in which, like, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't want to just belong to one country, right? Your true belonging transcends national boundaries. So how do you develop a sense of belonging in a country without becoming nationalistic?
It's a great question, Bill, and I know you and I talked a little bit about this. And so, you know, this country has always grappled with that nationalism that can verge on a form of xenophobia and nativism. And by verge, I mean just become xenophobia and nativism. And how people can remain particular, right? The things that make them unique, the things that make them like they belong to a specific community. And that, I think, applies as well to people of faith. And today, I think one of the outstanding questions, or large questions for the church, and I mean that broadly, is the problem of white Christian nationalism, right? Which is this mutation of the Christian faith specifically in service of xenophobic, nationalistic, white supremacist thinking. That is to say that you can't be Christian unless you create these very rigid boundaries about who can belong, not just in the faith, but within the nation. And this, of course, is just a ridiculous mutation of what most churches teach, right? This is just not, it's not based in Scripture, it's not based in good theology, and it's certainly not based in any form of good humanity. So for me, I think the thing to navigate, and to me, I think one of the interesting case studies is to look at Latinos who are falling into white Christian nationalism. And this is certainly not my field of study, so I don't want to get over my skis on this a little bit too much, because I focus more on the kind of these progressive manifestations within religious spaces. But sociologists, theologians who are studying the spread of white Christian nationalism within Latino communities, I think recognize, two different things. One is that it's a very powerful drug that pulls people in. And two, that Latinos are just like other immigrants. And one of the things that immigrants need to do in this country often to become American is to learn how to hate immigrants. So in the last election, there was this big to-do about the rising number of Trump voters who are also Latino. And often the ones who were most surprised by this were people who don't know any Latinos themselves, right? Because I have tios who, of course, voted for Trump in 2016 and, of course, voted for him in 2024. Why? Because Latinos are not a monolith. Because we bring all of ourselves to the voting booth. Because not all Latinos are immigrants, right? Some of them are fourth or fifth generation. And because they vote for many different reasons, including perhaps because they go to a church that teaches them a form of white Christian nationalism, and they believe it. So that's an end-around way to say that I don't have an answer, but I know what the opposition is, and it's certainly not consistent with the type of faith that I'm seeing represented in these movements that are inclusive, that open the boundaries of who gets to belong, that extend a welcoming hand without expecting anything in return. And so I think this offers a better alternative to those visions of a form of nationalism and Christianity that ultimately is a dead end. All right, thank you all. I appreciate it.